Okay, well, heartbreak tonight for a La Puente family who lost a father in a freeway shooting. Police are still searching for the suspects and a motive. KCAL 9's Jeff Nguyen spoke to a friend of the victim and has more on the investigation.
The canal water moves slow this time of year, thick with August heat, cutting a straight silver line through the farmland west of Phoenix. It's the kind of water nobody looks at twice, until someone does. Just after sunrise, a passerby near Miller Road and Southern Avenue notices something in the current that doesn't belong there. Not debris, not an animal, a shape half submerged, moving with the water instead of against it. The call comes in fast. Within minutes, Buckeye police units are threading through the agricultural roads south of town, and by the time they reach the canal bank, there's no question left about what they're looking at. A man's body, pulled from the water, for gunshot wounds already visible before the medical examiner says a word. He'll be identified as Luis Victor Mendoza, 31 years old, shot 4 times with a .22 caliber handgun at close range by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But here's what makes this scene different from an ordinary homicide. Nothing about it happened here. Not the shooting, not the struggle, not whatever conversation came before the trigger was pulled. This canal, this quiet stretch of farmland 35 miles from the nearest city block, is not a crime scene. It's a disposal site. Someone drove a body 35 miles into the desert specifically so that a moment like this one, a stranger noticing something wrong in the water, would happen as far from the truth as geography allowed. Buckeye detectives don't know it yet, standing at the edge of that canal, but they've just inherited one half of a story. The other half is sitting in an apartment across the valley, already sealed shut by fear. It will take 10 years, 2 police departments, for federal and state agencies, and one decision nobody could have predicted, for that fear to finally break. Because in this case, silence didn't fail on its own. It had to run out of time. To understand what happened at that canal, you have to go back one day, and about 35 miles east, to a residential address near 17th Avenue and Northern Avenue in Phoenix. According to court documents that would later anchor this case, this is where it started. Not in the desert, not in the water, in a home on an ordinary August night, in a neighborhood where nothing about the evening suggested it would end in a homicide investigation that would take a decade to close. Luis Victor Mendoza was there. So was Antonio Padilla, a 42-year-old Phoenix resident who, at the time, was already known to law enforcement, a man with a documented history of gang activity and weapons violations, the kind of record that doesn't show up overnight. That history matters not because it explains what happened in that residence with certainty, but because it's part of the official record, and it's part of why, when detectives eventually needed a name, they didn't need to guess. What exactly unfolded inside that residence on August 14th, the exact words exchanged, the precise sequence of what led to a gun being drawn, was never fully detailed in the public record. What is confirmed, through the official police account and court documents, is this. At some point that night, Antonio Padilla shot Luis Victor Mendoza 4 times with a .22 caliber handgun. It was not a struggle that spiraled out into something accidental. It was 4 rounds at close range, from a man who left that residence having made a decision he clearly intended to survive. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it's easy in true crime storytelling to rush past the shooting itself and get to the chase, the arrest, the resolution. But the 4 gunshot wounds recovered from Mendoza's body were the entire foundation of a case that wouldn't be solved for 10 years. Everything that came after, the canal, the cold case file, the decade of silence, exists because of what happened inside that residence in the space of what was probably only a few seconds. And whatever happened in that room didn't end with the last shot. Because a body doesn't move itself 35 miles into farmland outside Buckeye. Someone drove it there. Someone chose that canal, that stretch of road, that specific kind of disappearing act. By the time Buckeye police were standing at that canal the next morning, the truth of what happened at 17th and Northern was already 35 miles away and getting further by the hour. Detectives in Phoenix and Buckeye were about to become partners in a case where the crime scene and the discovery scene didn't just belong to 2 different police jurisdictions. They belonged to 2 different versions of the same night, and only one side was talking. For now, only one thing was certain. A man was dead. Another man had pulled the trigger. And the fear that decision created was about to outlast everyone's patience. Except, as it turned out, the fear itself. Before going further, it's worth pausing on something important. A lot of true crime content about this case leans hard into a dramatic version of what happened after the shooting. It makes for a gripping scene. But going back through the official Buckeye Police Department press release and the news coverage that followed the 2020 arrest, those specific details aren't part of the confirmed public record. So rather than dramatize what isn't documented, here's what actually is. What we know for certain is this. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Buckeye and Phoenix investigators moved fast. According to the Buckeye Police Department's own account, detectives interviewed a number of witnesses and identified a potential suspect within the earliest stages of the investigation. That's a critical detail because it tells you the case wasn't a mystery in the way most cold cases are. There was no whodunit in the traditional sense. Detectives had a name almost immediately. What they didn't have was enough to make an arrest stick. That distinction matters enormously in how homicide cases move through the justice system. Knowing who likely committed a crime and being able to prove it in a courtroom are two entirely different thresholds. Prosecutors need witnesses willing to give sworn, consistent statements, the kind that can survive cross-examination, and in the days after Mendoza's death, that's exactly what investigators didn't have. What's confirmed, and it's quieter and, in some ways, more frustrating from an investigative standpoint, is this: leads that seemed promising began to dry up. Witnesses who had something to say weren't saying it in a way prosecutors could use. And a case that started with detectives already holding a suspect's name began sliding, week by week, toward the exact outcome every homicide unit dreads: a file that stays open because the truth exists, but can't yet be proven. It's tempting to fill that silence with speculation about what pressure those early witnesses might have been under. We don't know for certain, and this isn't going to invent a version of events that sounds satisfying but can't be verified. What we do know is the outcome. Somewhere in the weeks and months following August 2010, the momentum investigators had built in those first critical days started to fade. And a case that once had a name attached to it almost from day one was about to spend the next decade in exactly the place every unsolved homicide eventually lands: a drawer, a file number, and a family still waiting for someone to pick it back up. There's a structural problem baked into this case that has nothing to do with witnesses, evidence, or fear, and everything to do with a map. Luis Victor Mendoza was killed at a residence near 17th Avenue and Northern Avenue in Phoenix. His body was found 35 miles away, in a canal near Miller Road and Southern Avenue, inside the city limits of Buckeye. Two different cities, two different police departments, two different chains of command, all trying to solve what was, in reality, a single homicide. This isn't a minor procedural footnote. It's one of the central reasons this case took 10 years to close. Buckeye Police Department had the discovery scene, the canal, the water-damaged remains, a location with almost no forensic connection to where the crime actually happened. Water is not kind to evidence. Whatever physical clues might have clung to Mendoza's body or clothing at the moment of death were already degrading by the time he was pulled from that canal. The actual crime scene, the residence near 17th and Northern, sat inside Phoenix city limits, under Phoenix Police Department jurisdiction. It required coordination, information sharing, and cooperation between two separate departments, each with their own caseloads, their own detectives, and their own open homicides competing for the same limited hours in the day. To their credit, and this is confirmed by Buckeye Police Department's own account, investigators moved quickly and effectively in those early stages. They didn't get stuck in jurisdictional gridlock. They successfully traced Mendoza's death back to the Phoenix residence and identified a suspect. That's a real accomplishment. But identifying a suspect and building a prosecutable case are two different mountains to climb, and the second one required something that no amount of jurisdictional cooperation could manufacture on its own: witnesses willing to testify consistently on the record in a courtroom. Without that, all the coordination between Buckeye and Phoenix detectives ran into the same wall. By late 2010, that's exactly where this case stood. Two departments, 35 miles apart, both holding half of the same story, both knowing who they believed was responsible, and neither one able to move the case across the finish line. Nobody working the case in 2010 could have known it yet, but that file wouldn't move again for almost a decade. And when it finally did, it wouldn't be new evidence that cracked it open. It would be time itself and one man's unrelated decision that would eventually put him back in a cell, just long enough to change everything. There's no dramatic scene to describe for most of this chapter, and that absence is exactly the point. According to Buckeye Police Department's own account, after that early momentum in 2010, the case simply stalled. Leads dried up, in the department's own words, and the investigation went cold. Not closed, just cold in the specific sense homicide detectives use that word. No new information coming in, no witness stepping forward, no forensic development to chase. A file that technically stays open forever, but functionally stops moving. This is the part of true crime stories that rarely gets dramatized, because there's nothing visually dramatic about it. No confrontation, no chase, just years accumulating on a case number, while detectives who once worked it get reassigned, retire, or shift their attention to newer homicides with fresher leads and more cooperative witnesses. That's not negligence. It's the reality of how every homicide unit in the country has to triage its caseload. What's confirmed, and what matters most from a human standpoint, is this. For the better part of a decade, nobody was arrested for Luis Victor Mendoza's death. Antonio Padilla, the man detectives had identified early on as a suspect, was not in custody for this case during that period. It's worth being honest about what we don't know here, rather than filling the gap with invented drama. We don't have public documentation of exactly how Mendoza's family experienced those years. What we do know is the outcome. A homicide with an identified suspect and a known cause of death sat unsolved for 10 years, which, as the story will show, is not actually unusual. It's close to the norm. Cold cases don't stay cold because police stop caring. They stay cold because the two things every homicide prosecution ultimately depends on, physical evidence and witness testimony, had already reached their limit early on, and neither one was going to improve just by waiting. Except, in this case, something was quietly changing that had nothing to do with the investigation itself. Antonio Padilla's life, away from this case entirely, was about to intersect with the criminal justice system for a completely separate reason. At some point in the years following the Mendoza homicide, Antonio Padilla was convicted on charges unrelated to this case entirely, a weapons violation and gang activity, according to the Buckeye Police Department's official statement. Not first-degree murder. A separate case, a separate prosecution, a separate sentence, one that had nothing to do with Luis Victor Mendoza at all. And yet, in hindsight, this is the single most important development in the entire 10-year gap between the murder and the arrest. Here's why. For the Mendoza case to move forward, Buckeye detectives didn't need a forensic breakthrough. They didn't need new DNA technology or a genetic genealogy database. What they needed was something far more human and far harder to manufacture. Witnesses who had gone quiet for years to become willing to talk again. And people don't change their willingness to talk because of new evidence. They change because their circumstances change. Padilla being incarcerated on that unrelated weapons and gang charge did something the original 2010 investigation never managed to do on its own. It physically removed him, for a defined period of time, from the community and the people connected to the Mendoza case. According to the Buckeye Police Department, Padilla was released from that Arizona State Prison in February 2020. To the outside world, this looked like nothing more than one more parolee walking out through the gates, unconnected to any active investigation. Nobody issued a press release. Nobody flagged it as significant. But it started a clock that Padilla had no way of knowing was running. Because 3 months later, in May 2020, Buckeye Police Chief Larry Hall made a decision inside his own department that had nothing to do with Padilla specifically, and everything to do with what would happen to him next. In May of 2020, Buckeye Police Chief Larry Hall restructured the department's Criminal Investigation Division and created something the department hadn't had before, a dedicated major crimes unit. 2 highly experienced homicide detectives were added to an already capable team of investigators, with a specific mandate that most departments simply don't have the resources to prioritize. Going back through the backlog of unsolved cases and giving them a second look. It's worth pausing here, because this decision is easy to skim past in a story that's ultimately about an arrest, but it's arguably the most consequential single choice in this entire 10-year timeline. Most small and mid-sized police departments operate with detectives who are perpetually stretched across active caseloads. Cold cases don't get solved by accident. They get solved when someone in a position of authority makes a deliberate resource decision to dedicate detectives specifically to cases that have no immediate public pressure attached to them, no media spotlight, and no guarantee of ever producing a result. Chief Hall made that decision anyway in the middle of 2020 for reasons that had nothing specifically to do with Luis Victor Mendoza. It was a structural choice about how the department as a whole would operate, and it worked almost immediately. In early July 2020, just weeks after the Major Crimes Unit was stood up, detectives began auditing the department's backlog of inactive homicide files. Somewhere in that stack was the 10-year-old case of Luis Victor Mendoza, a homicide with an identified suspect from day one, solid physical evidence establishing cause of death, and a decade-long gap where nothing had moved. As part of their standard review process, detectives cross-referenced Arizona's criminal databases, standard practice for reassessing any cold case. That's when they found the detail that changed everything. Antonio Padilla, the same man identified as a suspect back in 2010, had spent recent years incarcerated on an unrelated weapons and gang charge, and had only been released that February, just months before the Major Crimes Unit was even created. For the first time in 10 years, Buckeye detectives had something they hadn't had in 2010. A specific, verifiable reason to believe the situation on the ground might have actually changed. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the first real opening this case had seen since August of 2010. This is the chapter where a decade of silence actually broke, and it's worth being precise about what we know and what we don't, because this is exactly the point in the story where dramatization tends to creep in. According to the Buckeye Police Department's official statement, once detectives cross-referenced Padilla's release from prison with the reopened Mendoza file, they conducted extensive follow-up and identified key witnesses to the murder of Mendoza. That phrase, extensive follow-up, is doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence. It represents what was almost certainly weeks of re-interviews, re-established contact with people who had gone silent for 10 years, and the kind of patient, unglamorous investigative work that rarely gets dramatized because it doesn't look like much from the outside. What is confirmed is the result. All of the witnesses identified by the Major Crimes Unit gave statements naming Antonio Padilla as the shooter. Not some. Not most. All of them. Independently, according to police, these witnesses converged on the same account of what happened at that residence near 17th and Northern Avenue back in August 2010. That result is the single most important development in this entire case. For 10 years, detectives had a name but no courtroom-ready case. What extensive follow-up produced in the summer of 2020 was the missing piece. Witnesses willing to go on record. Sworn, consistent testimony is one of the most powerful tools in any homicide prosecution, and for the first time since 2010, Buckeye's Major Crimes Unit had it from multiple sources, all pointing at the same man. Chief Larry Hall would later describe this outcome as exactly what he'd hoped for when the unit was created. With sworn statements now in hand, the Major Crimes Unit had what it needed to take the next step. A felony arrest warrant, charging Antonio Padilla with first-degree murder. But knowing where to find him and safely taking a man with his documented history into custody was about to require considerably more than paperwork. With a felony arrest warrant now signed for first-degree murder, Buckeye's Major Crimes Unit faced a problem that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with logistics. Antonio Padilla had a documented history of gang activity and weapons violations. He had just been released from prison months earlier on those exact charges. Taking a man with that profile into custody safely wasn't something one department could, or should, attempt alone. So Buckeye Police brought in reinforcements. The Phoenix Police Department, the U.S. Marshal Service, and the Arizona Department of Public Safety all became instrumental partners in tracking Padilla down and taking him into custody. For agencies working in coordination with a single shared objective: locate him and bring him in without giving him any opportunity to disappear or to do anything else. In the early morning hours of Wednesday, July 22, 2020, that coordination paid off. Phoenix police located Antonio Padilla near 19th Avenue and Bell Road. With assistance from the Arizona Department of Public Safety, officers took him into custody during a traffic stop. According to police, the arrest happened without further incident, a detail that matters given who they were dealing with and given what they found next. At the time of his arrest, Police said Padilla was armed with a loaded semi-automatic rifle, fitted with a full magazine. As a convicted felon, Padilla was legally prohibited from possessing that weapon at all. 10 years after a homicide investigators couldn't fully close, and months after walking out of prison on an unrelated weapons charge, the man they just arrested for murder was driving through Phoenix armed and ready, exactly as he had been in 2010. Padilla was booked into Maricopa County Jail on suspicion of first-degree murder. He was held in lieu of a $1 million bond. Prosecutors, laying out the case for pretrial detention, pointed to his history, his prior convictions, and the loaded weapon found in his possession at the time of arrest as evidence that he represented both a serious flight risk and an ongoing danger to the community. Chief Larry Hall, reflecting on the outcome, said this was exactly the kind of result he'd hoped for when he created the Major Crimes Unit 2 months earlier, and that he expected more unsolved cold cases to see similar resolutions going forward. What is certain is this. A man who had evaded accountability for exactly 10 years was, as of that July morning in 2020, finally sitting in a jail cell, facing the charge that a decade of silence had, until then, been enough to prevent. It's tempting, watching a case like this resolve, to assume it represents how cold cases usually go. It doesn't. A U.S. Department of Justice review of cold case investigations across more than 1,000 law enforcement agencies found that success rates are low across the board. Roughly 1 in 5 cold cases ever gets cleared, and only about 1 in 100 cold case investigations actually results in a conviction. That same review found that only 1 in 5 agencies surveyed even had a formal protocol for initiating cold case work in the first place. Set against those numbers, what happened with the Mendoza case looks less like an inevitability and more like an outlier that required a specific set of conditions to align. A department that made the deliberate choice to fund and staff a dedicated major crimes unit. Detectives willing to cross-reference old case files against current custody records. And, critically, a suspect whose life circumstances shifted just long enough, for witnesses who'd been silent for a decade to finally speak. That last part is worth returning to directly, because it's the piece of this case people online tend to get wrong. There's a common assumption in true crime discussions that cold cases get solved through forensic breakthroughs, new DNA testing, genetic genealogy databases. None of that happened here. The physical evidence in this case, the .22 caliber gunshot wounds, was established in the very first days of the investigation back in 2010 and never changed. What changed 10 years later wasn't the evidence. It was the willingness of people who already knew the truth to finally say it out loud. That's a different kind of resolution than most true crime stories deliver, and arguably a more instructive one. It didn't take a lab. It took a department willing to prioritize a case with no fresh leads and no media pressure attached to it, and 2 detectives willing to go find people who had spent 10 years too afraid or too reluctant to talk, and give them a reason to trust that this time, speaking up wouldn't cost them anything. Go back, for a moment, to that morning at the canal near Miller Road and Southern Avenue. A passerby noticing something in the water that didn't belong there. A body pulled from a stretch of farmland 35 miles from where the truth of that night actually lived. At the time, nobody standing on that canal bank knew how long it would take to close the distance between those 2 locations, 35 miles of geography, and 10 years of silence. What eventually closed that gap wasn't a breakthrough in a lab. It was a police chief's decision to build a unit nobody had budgeted for before. It was 2 detectives willing to open a file that had every reason to stay shut, and enough patience to go find people who hadn't spoken about that night in a decade. It was witnesses once willing to talk, giving statements that all pointed, independently, at the same man. And it was a loaded rifle in a car on 19th Avenue and Bell Road that confirmed, without needing a single extra word, exactly what kind of man Buckeye's major crimes unit had just taken off the street. Antonio Padilla evaded a first-degree murder charge for exactly 10 years. Not because the case against him was weak, and not because investigators didn't know his name. He evaded it because, for a decade, nobody who could put that name on a sworn statement was willing to do so. When that changed, in the span of a few weeks in the summer of 2020, everything that had been true since August of 2010 finally became provable. Luis Victor Mendoza's case sits today in a category most homicides never reach. One where a name, a weapon, and a sequence of events that were suspected from nearly the very beginning were eventually confirmed in a courtroom-ready case. That doesn't happen because of luck. It happens because a department decided a 10-year-old file with no fresh leads and no public pressure was still worth someone's time. If a case like this, one where the break didn't come from a lab, but from timing, structure, and two detectives willing to go looking, is the kind of story that keeps you watching. There's another cold case on this channel where the break came from something completely different. A single piece of physical evidence that sat untouched in a police storage unit for more than 20 years, waiting for someone to finally test it. That one's next.